All right, we're going to do it again. Hello and welcome to the Recovered Republican. My name is Brianna, and today I am going to be speaking about the stories about COVID 19 that affected our lives and shaped who we are today. Because so many people went through COVID and we never heard about what actually happened to people. We knew people who during the first initial shutdown were very bored. People did not want to stay inside, and they learned how to make things like bread or got crafty, things like that. But there were so many of us that went through completely different experiences with COVID, particularly in myself. I am a COVID widow. So, what had happened is I was working in a nursing home and I was also taking care of my husband, who had been off work for a hip replacement that he had had the previous year. Unfortunately, there were some complications with his hip replacement that required 6 other surgeries. So he was already at higher risk, but I was really focused on that. To be quite honest, I was extremely burnt out at the time that COVID was said to be in America for the first time. And while I was worried, I was still just trying to survive. And I didn't know what to think because we had had these scares before with different types of influenza. And so I remember wondering if this was really going to be bad or if this was just being blown out of proportion and then nothing would actually really happen. Well, during that time, my late husband Lou actually got hospitalized for shortness of breath in February. And that was when we were starting to hear that COVID was going to be in America and people were hoarding toilet paper and other supplies. And I remember picking him up from the hospital the day he was going to be discharged, and him and the nurse joking about how they thought that in a few weeks people would feel silly for buying all this toilet paper because everything would go back to normal. Unfortunately, that's not what happened. Things got worse, and he never really got better. And about a week and a half after he came home from the hospital, I started to have similar symptoms. And I really did think that I would have gotten severe COVID out of the two of us because I have autoimmune disorders. And they were telling us that it was likely if you have autoimmune disorders, you are more likely to get severe COVID. So we were, of course, worried. And we were already trying to mask and do all the things that you would do to protect yourself. But I started having shortness of breath, and about a week later, he started having shortness of breath again. So I don't really know if we like gave it to each other back and forth a couple times, or if he never got better. But on March 31st, his oxygen levels were just in the toilet, and they tanked, and we couldn't get them up with the things we had been doing before. He was so short of breath, he could not put on his shoes. And so I had to do it for him and help him into the car. And when I got to the hospital, I was not allowed to go in. I was told to stay in like a breezeway between 2 doors, and these nurses were standing behind plexiglass 6 feet away. There was a dot in the middle of the room, and I was supposed to tell them what was going on. They came out in what looked kind of like a hazmat suit, to be honest, to come get him. He didn't actually let me kiss him goodbye. He was afraid he would give it to me, but hindsight being 2020, I already had it at that point. And so they wheel him away, and the last thing I hear him say is, "I can't breathe." And I watch him go, and they tell me to go home after I finish the registration. And I do. I mean, they're not going to let me go in. I guess I could have tried to force my way in, but pretty sure that would have just gotten me arrested. So I went home, and his doctor called, and that they said that they thought he had COVID and that they would need to intubate him. And I did not think that was going to go well. And as soon as I get on the call with the doctor, I get a message from Lou that he needs to talk to me, and like they're gonna, that I need to talk to him right now. And so after I hurry off the phone with the doctor, because they also tell me they're going to transport him to a different hospital where they were keeping all the COVID patients. And this was before we even knew his COVID test was positive. We didn't actually find out his COVID test was positive until he was in the other hospital. So I talked to him on FaceTime. Sorry, this is the hard part to talk about. Because that's all I could do was talk to him on FaceTime. It wasn't a long conversation. We said that we loved each other and that he said he would keep fighting and that he needed to come home to us, me and our dog. And, we had just been married in 2018. This is the beginning of 2020. But we were married at the end of 2018. We were only married for 17 months. So that's how I had to say goodbye to my husband, was over FaceTime, because, and I really do believe that at least I could have been there with him, and it would have been different if Donald Trump had taken China's warnings seriously when they were first told about it. But being Donald Trump, he didn't. And as a result, so many people lost their lives. And I think that if we had been taking proper precautions earlier, that hundreds of thousands of lives could have been spared. Unfortunately, once he was in the hospital, they told me, as soon as he got to the next hospital, they told me that he was young and healthy and that they expected him to make a full recovery, and they thought he would be on a vent for 2 weeks, and then they would slowly wean him off of it and probably go to rehab and all that. He was still conscious when he got to the second hospital. He was vented and conscious and trying to communicate with the nurse. And the nurse told me that they gave him more sedation medicine because they wanted his lungs to rest and they didn't want him fighting the machines. It was just a lot of me calling the hospital and trying to find out information, figure out what they were doing for him, if I could get into the hospital, if I could offer my services as a speech language pathologist and a medical provider for free, just so I could go see him. I was willing to do anything to get into the hospital to see my husband at the time. And I called everyone. I called hospice. I called the administrators. I didn't know what to do. Everywhere I turned, I was just getting told, no, you can't come in. And then things started getting worse. His fever spiked, and then eventually it broke, and we thought we were out of the woods. But within 24 hours later, they were telling me that he had 24 to 48 hours to live and that it was not going to go well. And I needed to get in. And again, I started calling people, couldn't get in. Luckily, my dad actually had a connection that allowed me to go into the hospital and say goodbye to my late husband for 30 minutes. And I was able to hold his hand. I was in full protective equipment, including mask, gown, double gloves, double masks, the whole bit. Is shoe covers, hair covers, everything. I was not allowed to hug him or kiss him. His skin was so hot. No one ever talks about the fevers that came with that first strain of COVID. Yes, the breathing part was bad, but the fevers were equally as bad. I think that's actually what killed my husband, is that his fever got so high that his brain cooked. The night he died, it was 118 was his temperature. And at that point, that when it got to 108 was when I called and they told me his fever was 108. That was when I knew that I was going to lose him for sure. Because at that point, it's just cooking your brain. And he wouldn't want to live like that. And I knew that. And the thing that like a lot of people don't, I talk about it, but I don't think people get it. Like I was calling the hospital and like I would have them put the phone next to his head and I would just talk or sing to him every day, sometimes multiple times a day, because that was the only way I could be with him in any sense. Because the thing is when people are unconscious in the hospital, they can still hear you. Hearing is the last sense to go, even when we die. There's been studies on this. And it's when I was in the hospital saying goodbye to him, I think he could hear me. At least I like to think so. Because when I was there, like a tear escaped his eye, and one of the nurses told me every time I talked to him or sang to him, his vitals got better. And but it didn't ultimately matter. At the end of the day, he still lost his life to COVID, and it sucks. It shattered me. Losing your spouse, the pain is indescribable. The closest thing that I've seen that seems comparable is when people lose their child. That's the kind of grief that I was dealing with. And I didn't feel like I was ever going to recover. And, you know, it's like I couldn't even be in my own house after he died. As soon as he passed away, it was like 1:30 in the morning, like 1:32 in the morning. They called me. The doctor told me. I didn't process it. I just remember screaming and dropping the phone. I don't even know if I hung up. I was by myself when I found out, because people were afraid to be with me because it was likely that I was still positive for COVID at the time. And my mom and stepdad had been there earlier that day, but they would only be outside and we were distanced. Because at that time we didn't know how long it lived on surfaces even. And so after he passed away, my family decided that it was no longer safe for me to be in that house because we didn't know how long it would live on surfaces. So we actually stayed at a hotel for a week. And then we went back to the house and I had my parents and one of my friend's husbands came over and we had to sanitize my entire house. I say I was very unhelpful. I was pretty much in shock still and pretty catatonic at that point. We had the funeral, but I mean, it was a virtual funeral. It's still on my personal Facebook. We could only have 10 people in the room, so we streamed it on Facebook because I just needed something. It felt undone. Like it was something I needed to do because I needed to see his body because like I felt because he died and I wasn't there and I wasn't able to be with him. I was worried that I would be unable to accept the fact that he was gone after he passed if I didn't have some sort of funeral and I didn't actually see his body. So I did have a funeral and I did kiss him at the funeral home because it's the only option I had if I wanted to. And I will tell you that formaldehyde feels really weird on your lips. I don't know if that's a bad thing, but that's okay. You know, it's real. Yeah, you know, formaldehyde on the lips because that's part of the embalming process. So, but the reason why that is the catalyst for me to becoming a leftist or a recovered Republican, whatever you want to call it, it's because after that, as a 31-year-old widow, I realized that there are so many people in this country that are very hateful, because I started speaking out against not wearing masks and saying, you need to wear a mask, you need to distance, this is real, you don't know who's going to get it, you don't know who's going to get it severely. And I would try to make the point that my husband, his blood work at the time was much better than mine. I was not in a good place medically back then. And while neither one of us were perfect, he was still healthier than me. But for some reason, he was more susceptible to severe COVID than I was. And the only thing that they seem to have figured out is genetics is the thing. And it's just like anything else, right? It's genetics. And, it was hard to get to that place. It really was, because I was very angry for a very long time. There was issues with life insurance. And so I was talking to lawyers about that, and they wanted me to talk to people about malpractice suits. And I did, because they advised me to. Those lawyers stated that there was no malpractice because there was nothing egregious that was done. And since we were in a state of emergency and in a pandemic, it has to be like extra egregious, because nobody knew what they were doing. We had never encountered this before. And so they were just trying everything they could to save these people. And it just made me so upset that people thought doctors who were literally sacrificing their mental health and sacrificing their well-being, trying anything they can to save these patients, were being targeted and being called essentially serial killers, because people were saying that the doctors were killing people on purpose. And that's just absurd to me. People who take an oath of non-malfeasance are not going to suddenly become a serial killer for an administration. It's just not going to happen. So I started getting all of these hate messages. People would troll me on the funeral itself and saying that it was fake, because somebody told a funny story about my late husband during the funeral, and people laughed. And it's like, yes, people laugh sometimes in grief. You experience lots of emotions in grief. And a lot of this hate came from people who considered themselves Christians. And so it led me to start looking at really what the Republican Party was doing, and looking at what they said they were going to do and what they actually did. And what I was finding is that they were often voting in a way that was actually hurting the American people. And it just led me down this rabbit hole of deconstruction, and it pulled the veil over my eyes. And I'm to a point where it's like, it can't go back in the box. This was my Pandora's box moment where it opened. I was already headed towards this direction. I just feel like it sped it up so incredibly much. And it's what's made me continue to speak out, because this is wrong. What's happening in our country isn't right. People being unalived by federal agents, by ICE, is not okay. It shows that no one is safe. Not that I thought we were before, not that I'm saying that white people matter more, just that this shows that these people in ICE are deranged enough to run after a car, because if you go frame by frame, you see him go after the car and know she was not hitting him with the car. He actually moved out of the way of the car, and he ran after her to shoot her 3 times through the driver's side window. Yet there are still people defending that ICE agent's actions. And it just further shows that some people, I don't know if some people can get it. Maybe there are some people who can't get it. But it's like they need it shoved in their face so hard that it blows the veil off of their eyes. And how do you do that? I've thought a lot about this. How do you make more recovered Republicans? And the answer is you start asking them questions about what they believe and why, and then you bring up counterpoints gently. You don't come at them in a way that's attacking. If you come at them and say, you're an idiot, you're wrong, what are you thinking? You're crazy. You're never going to get anywhere. Now, there are people that are crazy and that you're never going to get anywhere anyway. Those aren't the people I'm talking about. I mean, just like normal people. If you attack someone, if you go on the attack first, they're never going to listen to you. They're going to turn off their ears immediately. So instead, if I know somebody is a Republican and believes things that are not true and they're talking about it, I will start asking them about it. So, for example, if you're talking about Palestine, saying things like back when they were starving people and, preventing all the food from coming in, it's like, why would they do that? Children and women are not a part of Hamas. So what is the justification for starving and essentially unaliving all of these women, children, and men who are not a part of Hamas? And that hits differently than saying there's a genocide over there, you should be opposed to it because it's the right thing to do. They're never going to see it that way. You have to show them why it's wrong in a way they can understand. So start asking questions to people. It's never a bad thing. Start thinking about reframing how you talk to people. Instead of, I keep saying this, but instead of saying tax breaks for the wealthy, start saying socialism for the wealthy, or saying things like, social safety nets for the wealthy, anything like that. Use their own words against them because they are primed to understand this. If you call it socialism for the top 1%, they are more likely to understand it's bad than if you try to explain to them why we need a progressive tax system. Well, I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I know this was a short episode, but I wanted to get into a little bit more of the nitty-gritty in my story that I didn't get to in the previous episode. So thank you for tuning in. I appreciate those who gave support in the comments. And remember to subscribe if you're not already. You can find The Recovered Republican on Substack, Spotify, Apple Podcast, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. And if you also go to the PIN network on Substack, the Progressive Indiana Network, you can also find me there. Thank you so much for joining in, and let's go Hoosiers. Make sure to watch the game and cheer them on. Thanks, everyone.